There is a sign on a cobblestone alley in Philadelphia that reads, "Yes, people really do live here, and have since 1713. Not a museum, not a recreation. A real street, with real neighbors, where someone walked out their front door this morning to get their mail, brushed past a tourist pointing a camera at their house, and went back inside a building that has been someone's home continuously for over 300 years. Most people don't know that streets like this exist in America. The assumption is that the colonial-era fabric of American cities is gone, replaced by parking lots, office towers, and interstate highways. And mostly, that assumption is correct. Mostly, but not on every street. This list covers 10 streets and alleys where people are still living in houses built before America was a country, where the cobblestones are original, the brickwork is original, and the families who live there have made a collective decision, generation after generation, that some things don't need to change. By number 1, the street we end on was already old when the first English settlers arrived. In the 1950s and 60s, Providence, Rhode Island, was doing what most American cities were doing, tearing down its older neighborhoods to make way for highways, urban renewal projects, and the assumption that newer was always better. Benefit Street was on the list. The mile-long stretch of colonial and federal-era houses running through College Hill, directly above Providence's downtown, was slated for clearance. The buildings were deteriorating. The neighborhood was declining. The plan made a certain kind of mid-century sense. Then the Providence Preservation Society stepped in, and one of the most significant neighborhood preservation campaigns in American history began. Benefit Street today is known as the Mile of History, a designation that undersells it considerably. The street contains the highest concentration of colonial and early federal architecture in the United States. Over its length, more than 200 historic structures from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries survive in continuous occupation. Not museums, homes, law offices, the occasional art studio. Buildings that have been in use, without interruption, since the century they were built. The John Brown House at 52 Power Street, completed in 1788, was described by John Quincy Adams as the most magnificent and elegant private mansion that I have ever seen on this continent. The Stephen Hopkins House, home of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, sits nearby. The First Baptist Church in America, founded by Roger Williams in 1638, anchors one end. But what makes Benefit Street different from a preserved block of landmark buildings is the ordinary houses in between the landmarks. The two-story federal-style row houses where people are still living ordinary lives, where the front stoops have been worn down by 200 years of people coming and going, where the window glass, in some houses, still has the slight waviness of glass that was made before machine manufacturing standardized it. The interstate highway that was supposed to run through College Hill was rerouted. Benefit Street is still there. The houses are still occupied. The glass is still wavy. The cobblestones on Chalmers Street in Charleston are not decorative. They were never installed to look charming or to create an aesthetic for a historic district. They are the original street surface, and the reason they exist has nothing to do with preservation. They are ship ballast. When cargo ships arrived in Charleston's harbor in the colonial era, they carried heavy stones as ballast to keep them stable in deep water. When the ships loaded up with cargo, cotton, rice, indigo, they needed to offload the ballast. The stones were unloaded onto the wharves and eventually used to pave the streets. The cobblestones under your feet on Chalmers Street came from the bottoms of ships that sailed to Charleston from across the Atlantic. Chalmers Street runs through the French Quarter of Charleston, the neighborhood established by French Huguenot refugees who arrived in the late 17th century, fleeing religious persecution in France. The Pink House at 17 Chalmers Street, built between 1694 and 1712, of pinkish Bermuda limestone shipped across the Atlantic, is among the oldest surviving buildings in South Carolina. The limestone itself, a relatively rare material in colonial American construction, was quarried in Bermuda and brought to Charleston by sea. the same sea that deposited the ballast stones in the street outside. The Pink House was originally a tavern. It later became a residence. It is now an art gallery. The question of exactly when it was built, 1694, 1712, somewhere in between, is, as one Charleston historian put it, fraught with landmines, because the documentary record is incomplete, and different archival sources give different dates. What is not in dispute? The building is real. The limestone is real. The cobblestones are real. And they all came from somewhere else entirely, and ended up on a street in Charleston that has been continuously used since the city was founded. The old slave mart at 6 Chalmers Street, built in 1859, is the last surviving slave auction facility in South Carolina. The building is now a museum. The street that contains it, this same cobblestone street of ballast stones and Bermuda limestone, contains within a single block a record of everything the colonial and antebellum South was: its commerce, its architecture, its religious diversity, and its crimes. People still live on Chalmers Street. The cobblestones are still uneven underfoot. The ballast stones are still there. On the morning of December 25, 1620, Christmas Day, the passengers of the Mayflower, who had survived the crossing from England, stepped ashore and began building the first permanent structure of their settlement. They had already spent weeks exploring Cape Cod and the harbor. They had already chosen their site. Now, in winter, with supplies running low and illness spreading through the ship, they started work. The first street they laid out was Leyden Street. It ran inland from the harbor, up a slight rise toward the hill they would fortify as their defensive position. The houses they built along it, small timber-framed structures, were the first houses in what would become New England. The street they built them on is still there. Leyden Street in Plymouth, Massachusetts, is considered the oldest continuously inhabited street in British North America. The original houses are gone. Fire, rot, and 3.5 centuries of weather saw to that. But the street itself follows the exact path the Pilgrims laid out in December 1620. The width, the alignment, the relationship to the harbor and to Burial Hill above, all unchanged. The houses that line Leyden Street today are not the original Pilgrim structures, but they are old by any other standard. The Howland House at the top of the hill, built in 1667, is one of only 2 surviving structures in Plymouth, known to have been occupied by actual Mayflower passengers. Jabez Howland, son of Mayflower passengers John and Elizabeth Howland, built it. The family lived in it. The building still stands. Walk from the harbor up Leyden Street, and you are walking the same path that William Bradford walked, the same path that Miles Standish walked, the same path that the 53 survivors of the Mayflower's first winter walked in the spring of 1621, when the season finally turned. The path is the same. The hill at the top is the same. The harbor at the bottom is the same. The Pilgrims built this street in December 1620 because they needed somewhere to put their houses. 400 years later, there are still houses on it. Duke of Gloucester Street, Doughty Street, to the residents who live there, was the main street of colonial Williamsburg from the moment the Virginia capital was established in 1699. It runs 3/4 of a mile from the College of William and Mary at one end to the Capitol building at the other, with the Bruton Parish Church and the Market Square midway between them. The width of the street, 99 feet, was specified in the original town plan. The distance between the buildings on either side was calculated to allow sunlight to reach both sides at all times of year, a practical consideration in a colony where fires were an ever-present risk. The street you can walk today in colonial Williamsburg is not entirely original. The reconstruction project that began in the 1920s and 1930s, funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr., rebuilt many structures that had deteriorated or been demolished over the preceding 2 centuries. But the street itself, the alignment, the spacing, the relationship between the Capitol and the college that frames both ends, this is the original 1699 layout, unchanged. And the street is still inhabited. The colonial Williamsburg Foundation employs approximately 400 people who live in the restored and reconstructed houses of the historic area. They are not performing for visitors during off hours. They are residents, living in 18th century buildings that have been carefully maintained, sleeping in rooms that were designed in the Georgian style of the early 18th century, walking out their doors onto a street that has been a street since before the American Revolution was a thought. At the College of William and Mary, the second oldest institution of higher education in the United States, founded in 1693, the Wren Building has been in continuous use since it was first constructed in 1695. It was partially destroyed by fire 3 times and rebuilt each time on the same footprint. Thomas Jefferson studied here. James Monroe studied here. The building is still in use today for academic offices and events. Duke of Gloucester Street has been a street for 327 years. Both ends still have the buildings they were designed to frame. Acorn Street is 9 feet wide. That is not a typo. The narrowest residential street in Boston measures 9 feet across, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, and it is lined on both sides with Federal-style brick row houses built in the 1820s for the coachmen and domestic workers who served the wealthy residents of Chestnut Street immediately above it. The logic was vertical. The coachmen needed to be close to their employers' stables, close enough to respond quickly, but not on the same street. So the hill was terraced. A narrow lane was cut into the slope between Chestnut Street and Mount Vernon Street, and small brick houses were built along it for the working population that kept the Beacon Hill mansions running. Those houses are now among the most expensive per square foot residential properties in Boston. The cobblestones on Acorn Street are original, Belgian block paving stones, installed in the 1820s, that have been in place for 200 years. The city has attempted, on multiple occasions, to repave Acorn Street with asphalt for practical maintenance reasons. The residents have fought every attempt and won every time. The cobblestones are staying. The iron boot scrapers beside the front doors, installed in the 1820s so residents could clean mud off their boots before entering, are still there. The gas lamp fixtures have been converted to electricity, but retain their original cast iron forms. The basement-level kitchen windows, designed for a time when domestic servants worked below grade, still look out onto the cobblestones from below street level. On Acorn Street, the reason the street looks exactly as it did in 1828 is not that anyone decided to preserve it. It is that the residents have been resistant to any change whatsoever, and their resistance has been effective. The cobblestones are original. The boot scrapers are original. The street is 9 feet wide, and it is going to stay 9 feet wide. Church Street in Charleston is where you go to understand what the colonial city looked like before it knew it was going to become a historic district. The street was part of Charleston's original 1680 plan, the Grand Model, a grid laid out before the first permanent buildings were constructed. The lots were surveyed, the street widths were specified, and the relationship between the streets and the waterfront was calculated for a settlement that expected to grow. Church Street ran north from the waterfront, parallel to the Cooper River, through what would become the densest residential quarter of the colonial city. The buildings that line Church Street today represent almost every era of Charleston's history because the street has been continuously built and rebuilt since 1680. The Hayward Washington House at 87 Church Street, built in 1772 by Daniel Hayward and later occupied by George Washington during his 1791 Southern tour, is a double house, 2 rooms deep and 2 rooms wide on each floor, with a side piazza that became the characteristic feature of Charleston domestic architecture. Washington slept here. The bed he slept in is still in the house. The Pirate House at 145 Church Street, built around 1740, supposedly concealed a tunnel running from the basement to the harbor so that pirates could come and go without being seen from the street. Whether the tunnel is real or legend has been debated for a long time without resolution. The house is still there. The French Huguenot Church at 136 Church Street, built in 1845, on the site of earlier French Protestant churches, dating to 1687, still holds services in French 4 times a year. It is the only active French Huguenot congregation in the United States. The congregation has been meeting on this site since the 17th century. Every building on Church Street has been used continuously since it was built. None of them were ever abandoned long enough to decay beyond use. Charleston's building stock survived the Civil War. The Union Army occupied the city rather than burning it, and survived the 20th century's urban renewal programs because the preservation movement got here first. The street Washington walked in 1791 is still there. The bed he slept in is still in the house. The French Huguenot congregation is still meeting on the same corner. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European-founded city in the United States. It was established in 1565 by Spanish Admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, 42 years before Jamestown, 55 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. St. George Street, which runs through the heart of the historic district, has been the main residential and commercial thoroughfare of St. Augustine since the city's earliest days. The current street follows the original colonial layout, narrow, running north-south parallel to the bay, lined with buildings that reflect the successive waves of Spanish, British, and American occupation that the city has been through. In 1702, English forces from Carolina sacked and burned St. Augustine. They didn't get the fort. The Castillo de San Marcos, built of coquina shellstone, refused to burn, but they burned the town. The Spanish rebuilt. The city was British from 1763 to 1783, then Spanish again until 1821, then American. Through every change of flag, St. George Street stayed St. George Street. The Gonzalez Alvarez House, around the corner from St. George Street on St. Francis Street, is the oldest surviving house in Florida, occupied continuously since the early 1700s, built of coquina in the Spanish colonial style. The coquina walls, made of compressed shell fragments quarried from the beaches nearby, are 18 inches thick. They do not burn. They barely crack. The Castillo was built of the same material, which is why it survived the 1702 attack, while everything around it was ash. The houses on St. George Street that survived the British period and the Second Spanish period are built the same way: thick coquina walls, small windows, interior courtyards. They were built to survive the climate, the hurricanes, and the periodic arrival of armed forces belonging to competing European powers. They have done exactly that for 300 years, and the street they stand on has been a street since before the United States was a thought. There is a sign on Elfreth's Alley that reads, "Yes, people really do live here, and have since 1713. The sign is necessary because this is the thing that visitors consistently cannot believe. Elfreth's Alley is the oldest continuously inhabited residential street in the United States. It is also one of the smallest, a cobblestone lane barely 200 feet long and wide enough for a cart, running between Front Street and Second Street in Philadelphia's Old City neighborhood, flanked on both sides by 32 brick row houses built between 1720 and 1836. The alley was created in 1703 when 2 property owners, Arthur Wells and John Gilbert, agreed to open a pathway between their lots to allow cart access to the Delaware River waterfront. The path quickly became a street. Houses went up on both sides. By the mid-18th century, Elfreth's Alley was home to silversmiths, pewter workers, cabinet makers, tailors, and dressmakers, the working-class artisans who kept colonial Philadelphia functioning. The houses they lived in were small. They were designed as Trinity houses, 3 stories, 1 room per floor, each room directly above the other, connected by a steep stair in the corner. Philadelphia Trinity houses are a local invention, born of narrow lots and practical necessity. The locals called them Father, Son, and Holy Ghost houses. They are still the standard housing type on Elfreth's Alley, and people are still living in them. What almost ended the alley was the mid-20th century. By the 1930s, Elfreth's Alley had deteriorated, overcrowded, poorly maintained, threatened by the urban renewal projects that were clearing large parts of Philadelphia. A resident named Dolly Ottey organized the neighbors, formed the Elfreth's Alley Association in 1934, and began fighting for the street's survival. In the 1960s, the Interstate 95 construction project threatened to remove the alley entirely. The association lobbied for National Historic Landmark status, obtained it, and the highway was designed around the alley rather than through it. Today, I-95 runs directly behind the east end of Elfreth's Alley. You can hear it from the cobblestones. The residents of Elfreth's Alley open their homes to the public twice a year, on Fête Day in June, and deck the alley in December. The rest of the year, the houses are private residences. People live there. They have since 1713. The sign is not lying. If Elfreth's Alley is the oldest continuously inhabited residential street in British North America, Avila Street in St. Augustine is simply older. Pottery shards found beneath the layered brick paving of Avila Street date to the early 1600s. The street itself, however, follows a layout established in the 1570s, within a decade of the city's founding in 1565. It was originally called Hospital Street because the Royal Spanish Military Hospital stood here, serving the soldiers and settlers of the colonial outpost. The hospital is gone. The name changed to Avila Street in the 1920s, honoring the city's founder. The street is still there, following the same path it followed when St. Augustine was a Spanish military garrison on the edge of a continent that Europe was still trying to understand. The buildings on Avila Street today are not the original 16th century structures. Fire, hurricanes, and the repeated destruction of the city by English forces from Carolina saw to that. The Gonzalez Alvarez house nearby is the oldest surviving building in the city, dated to the early 1700s. The Father Miguel O'Reilly house on Avila Street itself was built before 1788 and is a typical example of second Spanish period coquina construction. What has not changed is the street's footprint, the width, the alignment, the relationship to the Plaza de la Constitución at one end. All of it follows the original colonial plan. When Spanish engineers laid out St. Augustine in the 1560s and 1570s, they used the standard Spanish colonial urban grid, a central plaza, with streets radiating at right angles. Avila Street was one of the first streets in that grid. It was here before England had a permanent settlement in North America. It was here before the Pilgrims were born. It was here before anyone in what would eventually become the United States had any reason to think about independence. The street is still there. People still walk it every day. Some of them live in buildings on it that predate the American Revolution by a century. Every city that has been continuously occupied for long enough has the same experience. Eventually, you dig down and you find the city that was there before. In Charleston, South Carolina, the city that was there before is not very far below the surface. Cumberland Street runs through the oldest surviving portion of Charleston's colonial grid. The streets established between 1680 and 1710, when the settlement was still enclosed within a wall and the population was small enough to know everyone who lived there. The street runs east from Meeting Street, toward the Cooper River waterfront, through a block that contains the oldest public building in South Carolina still standing. The Powder Magazine at 79 Cumberland Street was authorized in 1703 and completed in 1713. It was the colony's armory, the building where gunpowder was stored for the defense of the settlement. The walls are nearly 4 feet thick, the roof designed to channel a potential explosion upward rather than outward to protect the surrounding buildings. For 80 years, it stored powder. By 1780, it was deemed obsolete, and it was abandoned. In 1902, when a developer proposed demolishing the building, the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America purchased it, in one of the earliest preservation purchases in American history, and turned it into a museum. That intervention happened 123 years ago. The building is still standing. The walls are still 4 feet thick. The houses on Cumberland Street that date to the first decades of the 18th century are occupied today. Still private residences, still lived in. A debate that appeared in a 1945 Charleston newspaper about which house on the block was the oldest, number 83 or number 85, was never definitively resolved because the archival records from the earliest colonial period are incomplete, and because Charleston went through enough fires in the late 17th century that the documentation of what was built when is not always reliable. What is reliable is that this street, this block, this neighborhood has been continuously occupied since 1680. People have been living on Cumberland Street, in one form or another, in one building or another, for 346 years. The Powder Magazine is the oldest surviving public building in South Carolina. The houses around it are among the oldest surviving private houses in the state. And underneath the street, if you dig down through the brick paving and the packed earth below it, you find the layers, the 20th century, the 19th, the 18th, and somewhere beneath all of it, the 17th century colonial outpost that started this block, this street, this city, this country. The city that was there before is not very far down. Every street on this list was built for a reason that had nothing to do with preservation. Leyden Street was built because the Pilgrims needed somewhere to put their houses in December 1620, and they couldn't wait for spring. Elfreth's Alley was created because two property owners in 1703 needed a cart path to the river. Avila Street was laid out because Spanish colonial urban planning required a grid, and this was one of the first lines in that grid. Chalmers Street's cobblestones are ballast stones from ships that came to Charleston to take on cotton. Acorn Street was built for coachmen who needed to be close to the stables of the rich people who employed them. The houses on these streets were not built to last forever. They were built to be lived in, which is not always the same thing. What made them last was that people kept living in them, not as a historical exercise, not as a deliberate act of preservation, simply because the houses were there, and because the people who came after the people who built them found them worth keeping. The woman who fought to save Elfreth's Alley in 1934 was not a historian. She was a resident who didn't want her street torn down. The cobblestones on Acorn Street are still there because the people who live on Acorn Street have voted, repeatedly and successfully, to keep them. The houses on Leyden Street are occupied because someone has always found them worth occupying. This is what preservation actually looks like when it works, not a museum piece behind velvet ropes. A street where someone gets their mail in the morning, brushes past a tourist pointing a camera at their house, and goes back inside. The door has been opening and closing on these streets for 300, 400, even 450 years. It is still opening and closing today. Subscribe for more of the America that stayed. New videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.